Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Nagaruk. It's a pleasure to be here. It's really nice to be back in Barrow, and really enjoyed the meeting. Thanks so much. So I was invited to speak about the topic of Arctic system science. I was given no instruction, so I decided just to speak about what I thought this means to me, and hopefully has some meaning to you. So before we get started, I should probably say, what do I mean by Arctic system science? It's research on the interaction between the Arctic and Earth systems. There's relationships on physical, chemical, biological, and human. So what's an Earth system? Well, it's all the spheres. It's geosphere, biosphere, like we've heard today. We heard from Matt on the cryosphere, hydrosphere, and atmosphere. NSF has a whole section on Arctic system science. So actually, probably Frank should be given some credit than me. But when we think of Arctic system science, it advances our understanding of the Arctic as a coupled system, all the connections, a holistic view. It's interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary, depends on how do you want, or in the NSF language now, convergent research, right? Convergent, yeah. It often seeks to understand how humans drive or respond to environmental change. Some people just like to think of Gaia and the Gaia hypothesis, if you will. I think of all the people that understand the holistic aspects of this, probably Alaskan Natives are among the leading practitioners of this, understanding that all these things are connected. And as we've seen these gentlemen earlier this week, I just pay tribute to their holistic approach to understanding their environment. I like to couple these other photos too. This first lecture that occurred at the research lab by Professor John Field. And as some people recall, I asked yesterday about Walter Flagg because I was amazed to see an African-American up here from Swarthmore. And I thought that was really interesting and very far ahead of its time. He went on, by the way, to University of Pennsylvania after he finished at Swarthmore, as I've learned. So the Arctic system science is, in my view, everywhere. It almost depends on how you want to view it. So as an experiment, what I did in preparation for this presentation is to simply look through the past 4 issues of Science and Nature from June and July, so a total of once per week, just to see what kind of examples I could find that relate to Arctic system science. As it turns out, I found 11 examples, and it's amazing the breadth of topics that they cover. The UN calls use of wild species unsustainable. That has a significant impact on a place like the North Slope. We've heard about methane emissions already, an interesting twist on it. Glaciers in the tropics, turned out that they were moving in sync with those at the poles over the last 800,000 years. Focus on nuclear power as a solution, as we heard a little bit today in the DOE presentation. Polar bears warn Ukraine, impacting research. Climate risk is a financial risk, the economic factors here. U.S. gun policies, what research says about their effectiveness. That's certainly a significant factor in this state. Carbon layers, helicopter research, which I'll mention briefly, and then avian flu outbreaks in the Arctic flyway. The ones in white, I'll just give a little bit more detail. So this, how can I make this go away? There we go. So the UN just put out a report, and it says 1 in 5 people in the US depend directly on wild species for their food or their livelihood, but that the consumption is unsustainable. And this 4-year study concluded that more regulation is needed, as is curtailing illegal trade, use of timber for cooking, and so on. But what I was really curious when I was looking over this report, there was one mention of the Arctic one. And I had no idea to what extent did it consider Arctic indigenous peoples, and to what extent is the policy recommendations, are they equitable, and how are they tailored so that the indigenous people of Alaska can continue to survive and manage their resources. So it's interesting that you'll have something like this, and yet the connection to the Arctic is a little bit thin. Methane rising. I asked a question early in this meeting about that sharp increase, as you can see in the methane curve over the last about 10 years. And there's some new publications out, and that's a picture by Katie Walter in Alaska of some bubbles frozen in lakes. But there's some, and again, just as a little background, methane is probably responsible for about a third of the 1.2 degree warming since pre-industrial times. So tracking this in the atmosphere is extremely important. So we've heard that the Arctic is a source of methane. We heard that from the San Diego State University professor today, as well as from our NOAA colleagues. But recent research suggests that tropical wetlands, perhaps not the Arctic, are the primarily responsible for this acceleration over the last few years. And it turns out that increased rains from global warming are wetting tropical areas like the Sud in Sudan. There's a little picture of it there, and these are emitting a huge amount of methane. So while it's interesting that we're hearing about this in the Arctic, and it certainly is significant, and even methane that's coming from industrial leakage, such as at Prudhoe Bay, is another contribution. You have to look at these things in a global context, and that's why we're talking about Arctic system science. So that's another example, methane rising. Polar bears. Great article came out in the last couple of weeks about Christian Lader at University of Washington, who's and her team have determined that there's an isolated population of several hundred polar bears in the fjords of southeast Greenland. You can see the red area there, that they're genetically distinct and have been for at least 200 years from other polar bear populations. And they live in an area that has sea ice for only about 100 days a year. So these bears are living on an ice melange that's shedding off of glaciers in these fjords. They're hunting year round from ice that's coming off the glacier. So there's some consideration, is this the 20th polar bear population? Could this be some kind of refugia for polar bears in the future if there's in terms of a conservation question? So again, Arctic system science, you have to look at different regions, at the interactions of the cryosphere with the biosphere, and so on. So I like this example. The war in Ukraine, how does that have an impact on Arctic system science? Brendan Kelly, who will be here later today, was quoted as saying, it's a moral crisis we can't ignore. It's certainly putting a hold on research, especially between Russia and North America and Europe. Is this going to reshape global science, particularly in the Arctic region? Matt, who's here too, was quoted as saying in this Nature article, we're embarking on a multi-year, maybe even decadal scale interference to Arctic collaborations. Yet, as I think most of us would agree, especially the scientists, cutting off all research links is really in no one's interest. We have mutual interests in pursuing knowledge to address global issues like climate change. And perhaps some, like Vlad Romanowski up at UAF, would say, science should go on no matter what. So we have an interesting dilemma here, and it certainly is impacting Arctic research. This is one thing that I put together as another example of that. This is all the requests we've made to Russia to enter their exclusive economic zone in order to conduct marine scientific research over the past, since 1990. And you can see during the Glasnost period, perestroika in the early 90s, we had a lot of requests and we had a lot approved. But that's gone down over time, and now we're not even requesting to go into the Russian EEZ. So about 43% of the time, either we get no answer or we're told no. So this is a challenge, and this is an obstacle to research. And finally, the last example is an interesting term that I'm learning called helicopter research, and sometimes there's an associated term called ethics dumping. And helicopter research is field research that's generally considered to be in poor countries, where scientists extract data without respectful collaboration that violates research integrity and is a moral problem. So this big group, Conference on Research Integrity in Cape Town, had a big meeting, and they published a statement, and now they're going to publish a report about this. And they're trying to find ways to improve equitable research partnerships. And they don't want to leave that responsibility to individual researchers, interestingly, because it's too haphazard. And so while the focus really was on low and middle income countries, I think there's certain parallels with the research conducted up in the Arctic. So that kind of intrigued me and caught my eye. Ethics dumping is a term used where researchers export unethical or unpalatable experiments and studies to low middle income countries. So that's yet a different concern. So I thought that was interesting. And here's a local farmer in Ethiopia looking on as our researchers doing something. Okay, back to those are the examples. And now I have just a couple slides left. I want to say that the topic of Arctic system science as a discipline has been strong in government in this report, which is the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee's 5-year Arctic research program plan for 2022 to 2026. And if any of you have questions about this or about IARPIC, please talk to Melissa, who is here. I don't know if she's in the auditorium now, but she's certainly been at the meeting. She's the Indigenous Communication and Engagement Specialist on that. And specifically, it's called Priority Area 2, Arctic Systems Interactions. And this is a focus in that plan. And that's a picture of a U.S. ARC Commissioner, Jackie Richter-Mengy, back when she worked at the Army Corps of Engineers, who was doing some sea ice research. And my penultimate slide is here just to say a little bit about IARPIC and how my organization, the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, works with that, and how basically how federal policy works. So bear with me through this slide. The Commission puts out a report every 2 years, and we're working on our next report, which will be released for 2023, 2024, be later this year. This is a report we call Goals and Objectives for Research, where our commissioners, led by Mike Safraga, who's the chair of the Arctic Research Commission, we present that report to the President and Congress. IARPIC then takes that and creates a 5-year plan, and then that's built into the budget for the U.S. government. And then, as part of that process, the Office of Management and Budget is supposed to review all the agency research budgets. And then the commission is supposed to report to Congress about how well that budget matches up with the plan. And that's an interesting step that hasn't occurred for a long time, but we're hoping to see that change. We want to know how much we spend on our Arctic research, because right now we have a plan with no budget. And a plan with no budget in Washington is usually called a fantasy. So we'd like to see that change. And with that, if you want to learn more about the commission, you can subscribe to our daily Arctic update. And I thank you very much.